What if the greatest machinery of murder in human history was not born from chaos, but from careful, deliberate, methodical planning? What if the blueprints for genocide were drawn up in offices by trained architects and engineers, reviewed by bureaucrats, approved by administrators, and then built, brick by brick, beam by beam, into something that would consume over 1 million human lives? That is the story of Auschwitz. Not just a concentration camp, not just a symbol, but a vast engineered killing complex whose design told a story of calculated evil that its creators hoped the world would never fully understand. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on how it was built, who designed it, why they chose this site, and what every gate, every wire, every chimney was specifically intended to do. Because understanding the architecture of Auschwitz is understanding the architecture of the Holocaust itself. In this video, we will find out every detail of the evil design of Auschwitz and how it was deliberately constructed for one purpose above all others. So, without further ado, let's start from the very beginning. To understand how Auschwitz came to be what it was, we need to travel back to the spring of 1940, when Nazi Germany had just finished conquering Poland and was in the process of turning an entire nation into a laboratory for racial ideology. Poland was, in the eyes of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, both a vast reservoir of slave labor and a territory that needed to be depopulated, reshaped, and remade according to National Socialist principles. The occupied territories were filling up with political prisoners, resistance fighters, clergy, intellectuals, and Jews from the annexed regions. The existing concentration camps inside Germany, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, were already overcrowded. Himmler needed somewhere new. He needed somewhere large, somewhere remote enough to conduct whatever operations he deemed necessary, somewhere with access to rail lines and a sufficient water supply, and somewhere that could be expanded almost indefinitely. What he found in Upper Silesia, in a small Polish town that the Germans renamed Auschwitz, would become the most lethal site in human history. The town of Auschwitz in German, was a quiet market town of about 12,000 people on the banks of the Soa and Vistula rivers, roughly 50 kilometers west of Krakow. It sat at a junction of major railway lines, which made it strategically important for military logistics. On the outskirts of the town stood a cluster of red brick barracks buildings formerly used by the Polish army as a military transit camp and artillery depot. When Nazi forces rolled through in September 1939, those buildings were seized and repurposed as a temporary detention facility. But they were cramped, unsanitary, and poorly suited for long-term imprisonment. By early 1940, the SS and the regional administration were looking for something more permanent. It was Richard Glucks, the inspector of concentration camps for the SS, who first sent an inspection commission to Auschwitz in February 1940. The commission's report was largely positive. The existing brick buildings could be converted. The railway access was excellent. Lines ran in multiple directions, connecting Auschwitz to Krakow, Katowice, Vienna, and beyond. The surrounding area was sparsely populated and could be cleared of civilians. The rivers provided water. The flat plains around the town could accommodate almost any expansion. There were some concerns noted. The area was marshy and prone to flooding, and the local water table presented engineering challenges. But these were brushed aside. Himmler reviewed the report and issued his order in April 1940. A new concentration camp was to be established at Auschwitz. It was to be a camp for Polish political prisoners, initially holding no more than 10,000 men. No one at that stage was thinking about gas chambers. No one was thinking about crematoria with industrial-scale capacity. No one was yet drawing up blueprints for the systematic murder of an entire continent's Jewish population. That would come later, but the foundations were being laid, not just in concrete and brick, but in the bureaucratic structures and the psychological conditioning that would eventually make genocide possible. The man selected to command the new camp was a 39-year-old SS officer named Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss. His life story is one of the most chilling in the entire history of the Third Reich, not because of some dramatic evil that jumped from the page of his biography, but because of how ordinary it was, how it traced a path from respectable German conservatism to the commission of mass murder through a series of choices that each seemed to him perfectly rational and dutiful. Höss was born on November 25, 1900, in Baden-Baden, the son of a devoutly Catholic shopkeeper who had served as a colonial officer in German East Africa. His father was stern, religious, and deeply conservative, and he raised Rudolf to believe in obedience, duty, and the authority of institutions. His father wanted him to become a priest, and Rudolf briefly considered it, but the First World War intervened. In 1916, at just 15 years old, Höss lied about his age and enlisted in the German army. He served on multiple fronts: Iraq, Palestine, the Western Front, and by the time he was 17, he had become the youngest non-commissioned officer in the German army. He was awarded the Iron Cross first and second class and developed a taste for military discipline and order that would never leave him. After the war, like many German veterans who found peace difficult, Höss drifted toward nationalist paramilitary organizations. He joined the Freikorps, the irregular right-wing militias that waged brutal campaigns against communist uprisings in Germany and the Baltic states. He became involved in a political murder in Mecklenburg in 1923, when he and a group of associates killed a schoolteacher named Walter Kardau, who was suspected of having betrayed a nationalist hero to the French occupation forces in the Ruhr. Höss served 6 years of a 10-year prison sentence for his role in the killing before being released in an amnesty in 1928. Prison did not reform him. If anything, it hardened his contempt for conventional society and deepened his commitment to the nationalist cause. After his release, he attempted to live as a farmer in eastern Germany through the agricultural settlement movement associated with the Arteman League, a folkish group that promoted the idea of Germans returning to the land. It was through the Arteman League that he encountered Heinrich Himmler, who was also a member, and it was Himmler who, in 1934, persuaded Höss to join the SS and enter the world of concentration camps. Höss received his training and indoctrination at Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, under the tutelage of Theodor Eicke, who had systematized the camp system into a brutal but organized institution. Eicke taught Höss and the other camp guards the ideology of the SS Death's Head units, that the prisoners were enemies of the state who deserved no pity, no mercy, and no human consideration. Höss absorbed these lessons eagerly. He rose through the ranks, serving at Sachsenhausen as an administrative officer before his appointment to Auschwitz. When Himmler selected him to establish and command the new camp, Höss was 39 years old, methodical, humorless, and utterly convinced that whatever he was ordered to do in the service of the Reich was not only justified, but noble. He would later describe his emotional state during the construction and operation of the camp with a detachment that was itself more disturbing than rage or cruelty would have been. He simply did his job, and his job was to build something the world had never seen before. Höss arrived at Auschwitz on May 4, 1940, with a small team of SS officers and about 30 German criminal inmates brought from Sachsenhausen to serve as prisoner functionaries, the Kapos, who would enforce order among the incoming prisoners. What he found was a collection of 20 dilapidated brick buildings in various states of disrepair. The buildings were infested with vermin, lacked functioning plumbing, had no electricity in most sections, and were surrounded by open fields that flooded regularly in wet weather. The area around the camp was thick with mosquitoes from the surrounding marshes, and disease, especially typhus and dysentery, was endemic. In most contexts, these conditions would represent an insurmountable obstacle. For Höss and the SS, they represented an opportunity for prisoners to be worked to death while solving the problems of construction. The first prisoners arrived on June 14, 1940, 728 Polish political prisoners, most of them intellectuals, priests and activists, transported from the prison at Tarnow. These men became the first slave labourers of Auschwitz, and their work over the following months would transform the derelict barracks into a functioning camp. The design of Auschwitz I, the original main camp known as the Stammlager, was essentially improvised from the existing structures, but it followed the basic blueprint of German concentration camp architecture that had been developed at Dachau and refined at Sachsenhausen. The camp was enclosed by a double perimeter of electrified barbed wire fences with wooden guard posts at intervals. Within the fence, the existing 2-story brick barracks buildings were numbered in sequence and converted into prisoner housing, administrative offices, and utility spaces. The central roll call square, the Appellplatz, was positioned in front of the barracks, large enough to hold the entire prisoner population standing in formation for the twice-daily roll calls that could last hours, regardless of weather. The SS Commandant's headquarters, staff offices, and the camp kitchen were positioned near the main gate. Guard towers with searchlights and machine gun emplacements were built at the corners and along the fence line. The entire complex followed a logic of maximum visibility and control. Prisoners were to be observable at all times, unable to hide, unable to congregate without SS awareness, and constantly reminded of the absolute power of their captors. The entrance gate to Auschwitz I was equipped with a wrought iron inscription that has become one of the most recognized and sinister phrases in human history. Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. The sign was not unique to Auschwitz. Similar inscriptions had appeared at Dachau and other camps. But at Auschwitz it took on a particular grotesque irony, because for the vast majority of people who passed beneath it, work led not to freedom but to death. The sign was made by prisoner metalworkers, and legend has long held, and has been partially confirmed, that the letter B in the word Arbeit was deliberately welded upside down by the prisoners who constructed it, a small act of hidden defiance. The gate itself was manned by SS guards who checked prisoner columns in and out on work details, while the camp orchestra, established early in the camp's history to help the SS keep count of prisoners entering and leaving, played march music to keep the columns moving in time. The orchestra was one of many grotesque institutional features of Auschwitz that served a bureaucratic purpose while contributing to the surreal, dehumanizing atmosphere that the SS deliberately cultivated. The conversion of the barracks buildings proceeded rapidly through the summer and autumn of 1940, with prisoners performing all the construction work under SS supervision and capo enforcement. Each block was assigned a specific function. Blocks 1 through 10 and 12 through 22 were prisoner housing, each originally designed to accommodate about 700 men, though by 1942 they were holding 1,200 or more under conditions of extreme overcrowding. Block 11 at the far end of the camp was designated the punishment block, the place within the camp where the SS meted out the most extreme forms of torture, humiliation, and death to prisoners accused of infractions or targeted for special treatment. Between Block 10 and Block 11 stood the Black Wall, a courtyard enclosed by high screens on either side, where executions by shooting were carried out, often on a daily basis. It has been estimated that somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people were shot at the Black Wall of Auschwitz, one over the course of the camp's operation, though precise figures are impossible to establish given the deliberate destruction of records. Block 11 deserves particular examination because its design, or rather its adaptation, reveals the logic of systematic terror that ran through every corner of Auschwitz. The building was a standard 2-story brick block like all the others from the outside, but its interior had been radically altered to serve as a prison within a prison. The ground floor held cells used for administrative punishment. Prisoners could be sentenced to flogging on a wooden frame called a bock, to exhausting labour assignments, or to nights in a standing cell. The standing cells were perhaps the most ingenious instruments of torture that the camp designers created, measuring approximately 90 centimetres square, barely enough space for a single person. They were accessed by a small hatch at floor level. 4 prisoners at a time were forced inside and the hatch was locked. They stood through the entire night, unable to sit or lie down, then were expected to report for work the following morning as if nothing had happened. The basement of Block 11 contained additional cells, including dark cells, completely lightless, airless spaces where prisoners were sometimes left without food or water until they died, and the starvation cell, which held prisoners condemned to die of hunger. It was in the starvation bunker of Block 11 that, in August 1941, Franciscan friar and Catholic priest Maximilian Kolbe voluntarily gave up his life in place of another prisoner, Francis Gajowniczek, who had been selected for death by starvation as collective punishment. Kolbe was later canonized by Pope John Paul II as a martyr. Block 10 represents another layer of deliberate horror built into Auschwitz's design. It was designated the medical experimentation block, where SS physicians conducted experiments on prisoners, mostly Jewish women, that were unsanctioned by any medical ethics board and amounted to nothing more than torture dressed up in scientific language. The windows of Block 10 were boarded up from the outside to prevent prisoners from seeing or being seen, creating an atmosphere of complete isolation. The most notorious experimenter associated with Block 10 was Dr. Karl Kloberg, who conducted mass sterilization experiments on women in an attempt to develop a method for rendering entire populations infertile, a goal that aligned perfectly with Nazi racial ideology's desire to eliminate certain groups without the logistical burden of direct killing. But Block 10 also hosted experiments in wound infection, high-altitude survival, hypothermia, and poison injection. These experiments were not unique to Auschwitz. They were replicated at Ravensbrück and other camps. But at Auschwitz, they were conducted on an industrial scale that reflected the camp's broader character as a place where the boundaries of human cruelty had been systematically dismantled. The first commandant of Auschwitz also devoted considerable attention to the question of escape prevention. The electrified double fence was not considered sufficient on its own. Around the outer perimeter of the camp, a large security zone, the Interessengebiet, or Zone of Interest, was established, encompassing an area of approximately 40 square kilometers surrounding the camp. Within this zone, Polish civilians were expelled from their homes, agricultural land was seized, and the SS established absolute jurisdiction. Villages were depopulated, fields were cleared, and the landscape was reshaped to create a buffer zone in which any unauthorized movement was immediately suspicious. Guard patrols with dogs swept the zone regularly. Watchtowers were built at intervals along the perimeter road. This outer security ring served a dual purpose. It provided a practical barrier against escape, and it removed civilian witnesses from the immediate vicinity of the camp, shielding its operations from outside observation. The Poles who were expelled from their homes in the Interessengebiet numbered around 8,000 people. They received no compensation and no warning. They were given hours to gather their belongings and were simply displaced, their homes requisitioned for SS use, or demolished to improve sightlines and fire zones. As the summer of 1940 gave way to autumn, the prisoner population of Auschwitz grew rapidly, and with it, the pressure to expand. The original 20 blocks were overflowing. Typhus was ravaging the prisoner population. The mortality rate was already shocking by any standard except the one the SS was in the process of establishing. Höss wrote repeatedly to Himmler requesting more resources, more workers, more materials, and clearer guidance about the camp's long-term function. Himmler responded by sending inspection visits and issuing broad directives. In March 1941, Himmler personally visited Auschwitz for the first time and was impressed, or appeared impressed, by what he saw. He issued a set of expansion orders during that visit that fundamentally changed the camp's character and scale. The existing camp at Auschwitz I was to be expanded to hold 30,000 prisoners. A new separate camp was to be established 3 kilometers away, at the site of a village called Brzezinka, Birkenau in German, which would hold 100,000 prisoners of war, primarily Soviet soldiers who were expected to be captured in massive numbers in the coming war against the Soviet Union that was being planned for the spring. Agricultural facilities were to be developed in the surrounding area, using prisoner labor to drain the marshes and create farmland for SS agricultural experiments. And an industrial complex was to be built nearby, in partnership with private German industry, to exploit the vast slave labor pool that the camp would provide. That visit by Himmler in March 1941 was the turning point. It was the moment when Auschwitz transformed from a large but conceptually conventional concentration camp into something that had no precedent. The scale Himmler was envisioning was without parallel. 100,000 prisoners at Birkenau alone, farmland stretching across the reclaimed marshes, industrial facilities processing synthetic rubber and fuels, and at the centre of it all a camp complex that could receive, process, imprison, work and, though it was not yet openly stated, kill prisoners at a rate that no facility in history had ever approached. The architect of this vision was Heinrich Himmler, but it was the engineers, the planners, the construction managers, and the administrative officials who would translate that vision into physical reality. And they did so with a thoroughness and a professional pride that is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire story. By the time Himmler's expansion orders were being implemented in the spring and summer of 1941, Auschwitz already had an established bureaucratic structure governing its construction. The SS had a dedicated engineering and construction corps, the SS Construction Inspectorate, which was responsible for building and maintaining all concentration camp facilities. For the Auschwitz expansion, the relevant office was the SS Central Construction Office, known in German as the Zentralbauleitung der Waffen-SS und Polizei Auschwitz. This office was established formally in October 1941 and was headed by SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, a trained civil engineer who had joined the SS in 1939 and rapidly risen through its construction bureaucracy. Bischoff was meticulous. demanding, and technically proficient. He drove his office hard, sent dozens of letters to suppliers, contractors, and SS superiors, demanding faster delivery of materials and clearer specifications. His files, preserved after the war and among the most important documentary evidence of what Auschwitz was designed to do, are remarkable for their sheer bureaucratic ordinariness. They read like the correspondence of any construction manager dealing with delays, budget overruns, and supply chain problems. The language is dry, technical, and professional. The subject matter is mass murder. Working under Bischoff were a number of SS officers with technical training, most notably SS Untersturmführer Fritz Ertl and SS Untersturmführer Walter Dejakow, both qualified architects who had been assigned to the Auschwitz construction office and were personally responsible for designing and drawing up the plans for many of the camp's key facilities. Ertl and Dejakow, two names that deserve to be far better known than they are, sat at drafting tables in their offices on the campgrounds and drew the blueprints for the crematoria and gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau. They were not reluctant participants dragooned into the work against their will. They were professional architects applying their training to a construction problem. The fact that the facilities they were designing were intended to kill human beings was, in the documentation they left behind, simply a technical parameter. A specification that the gas chambers needed to hold a certain number of people, that the undressing rooms needed a certain throughput capacity, that the crematoria needed to operate continuously for a certain number of hours without mechanical failure. The moral meaning of those specifications did not appear in their drawings. It appeared in the consequences. The question of how many people Auschwitz was intended to kill, and when that intention first crystallized, is one that historians have debated for decades. The answer is not a single date or a single decision. It was a process, a gradual escalation driven by ideological imperatives, administrative pressures, and the specific circumstances of the war. In the spring and summer of 1941, the camp was expanding to hold Soviet prisoners of war. The expectation was that these men would arrive in enormous numbers following the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22, 1941. Within weeks, the German army had captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, and many of these men were expected to be sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was at that point still under construction. The Soviet prisoners who did arrive at Auschwitz in the autumn of 1941 were treated with exceptional brutality even by camp standards. They were deliberately starved, denied shelter, forced to sleep in the open in an unfinished camp, and worked to death at a rate that shocked even some SS officers. By the spring of 1942, the vast majority of the approximately 12,000 Soviet POWs sent to Auschwitz were dead. But even before their mass deaths had run their course, something else was happening at the camp that would change its character forever. On September 3, 1941, a significant and terrible experiment took place in the basement of Block 11 at Auschwitz I. The camp's deputy commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritsch, decided to test a commercial pesticide called Zyklon B on a group of prisoners to see whether it could be used as an execution agent. Zyklon B was a pesticide produced by a German company called Degesch, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schädlingsbekämpfung, the German pest control company, and was widely used in German camps for delousing clothing and bedding to prevent typhus. The active ingredient was hydrogen cyanide, a highly lethal chemical that killed by preventing cells from using oxygen, causing rapid asphyxiation. Fritsch had approximately 600 Soviet POWs and 250 sick prisoners brought to the basement of Block 11. The windows and doors were sealed. Zyklon B pellets were poured through openings in the ceiling. Within minutes, everyone inside was dead. Huss was not present for this first experiment. He was away from the camp, but he was briefed on its results when he returned. His reaction, recorded in his own later testimony, was not horror but satisfaction. The experiment had worked. Zyklon B was efficient, cost-effective, and left no bullets to account for. It was a cleaner method than shooting, and it was scalable. He immediately recognized its potential. The decision to use Zyklon B as the primary killing agent at Auschwitz was not made at a single moment, but emerged from a series of escalating decisions during the autumn and winter of 1941 and early 1942. The broader context was critical. In the summer of 1941, in the wake of Barbarossa, Hitler had given Himmler a verbal order. the exact wording of which was never written down and has been the subject of enormous historical debate, to implement the physical extermination of the Jewish population of Europe. This order activated a planning process that had been building for years. The Nazi regime had been persecuting Jews since 1933, progressively stripping them of rights, property, and citizenship. The forced emigration and then forced deportation of Jews had been the primary policy since the late 1930s. But by 1941, with much of Europe under German control and emigration no longer a viable option, the ideological logic of the regime was pushing toward murder on a continental scale. The mechanisms for carrying out that murder were still being worked out. In the eastern occupied territories, modern-day Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen were already shooting Jews in mass graves by the tens of thousands. But shooting was slow, required large numbers of personnel, was visible to local populations, and had a measurable psychological effect even on the SS men carrying it out. A centralized, mechanized alternative was being sought. And at Auschwitz, in the basement of Block 11, it had just been found. What happened between September 1941 and January 1942, when the notorious Wannsee Conference formally coordinated the implementation of the final solution across all German-occupied territories, was a process of bureaucratic and logistical alignment. At Auschwitz, it meant a fundamental redesign of what the camp was and what it was for. The camp was no longer primarily a facility for imprisoning and working Polish political prisoners, though that function continued. It was no longer primarily a facility for holding Soviet POWs, though some would continue to arrive. It was becoming something new, a killing center. And to become that killing center efficiently, it needed new infrastructure. It needed facilities specifically designed for mass murder rather than improvised from existing buildings. It needed crematoria that could dispose of bodies at the rate that mass killing would produce them. It needed a bureaucratic apparatus to process arrivals, conduct selections, and route people to their deaths or to labor without anyone, especially the victims themselves, understanding what was happening until it was too late. The design of Auschwitz-Birkenau was the answer to all of these requirements, and it was designed, consciously, deliberately, and with considerable professional skill, to do exactly what it subsequently did. The site chosen for Auschwitz, Birkenau, was the village of Brzezinka, a small settlement of about 300 wooden houses and farm buildings approximately 3 kilometers west of the main Auschwitz camp. In the late autumn of 1941, SS authorities ordered the Polish residents of Brzezinka and several surrounding villages to be evicted from their homes within hours. The villagers were allowed to take only what they could carry. Their houses were either demolished to clear space or requisitioned for SS use. Their fields were seized. Their community, which had existed for generations, was erased from the map in a matter of days. What replaced it was first mud, then wire, then a vast geometrically planned concentration camp that would grow to encompass 300 buildings on a site covering 175 hectares. Birkenau was planned on a scale that dwarfed anything the Nazi concentration camp system had previously attempted. When Himmler first ordered it, he envisioned it holding 100,000 prisoners. By the time it was fully developed, it held more than 90,000 prisoners at its peak in the summer of 1944, with additional tens of thousands arriving daily to be killed without ever being registered in the camp's population. The planning of Birkenau began formally in autumn 1941, with Bischof's Central Construction Office producing the initial site surveys and layouts. The first challenge was drainage. The land around Brzezinka was marshy and poorly drained, with a high water table that made conventional construction difficult. The SS solution was to use prisoner labour, particularly the Soviet POWs, who were already dying at the main camp, to dig drainage ditches and lay gravel foundations. The work was brutal beyond description. Prisoners worked in freezing mud, in inadequate clothing, with insufficient food, under constant SS and capo beatings, draining and grading the land that would become their own prison. Tens of thousands of them died doing it. The ground they prepared became the foundation for one of the most methodically designed killing sites in human history. The architectural design of Birkenau divided the camp into a series of distinct sections, known as Lagerabschnitte or camp sectors, each enclosed by its own electrified wire fence within the larger perimeter of the whole camp. The initial sections, Sector BY for women, Sector BII for men, were laid out on a strict grid pattern, The streets were numbered and named. Each row of barracks was precisely positioned. The watchtowers were placed at calculated intervals to ensure overlapping fields of fire and observation. Nothing about the design was accidental. Every dimension, every placement, every sightline was the result of deliberate calculation by trained engineers. The camp was designed as a machine, and every component of that machine had a specific function. The barracks that housed the prisoners at Birkenau were themselves a study in deliberate degradation. The first barracks constructed in Sector B were built using prefabricated wooden stable units, modular horse stable buildings originally manufactured by a German company for use in army veterinary facilities. Each stable unit was designed to accommodate 52 horses. At Birkenau, each was converted to hold between 400 and 500 human prisoners. The stable buildings had no insulation, no heating in winter, and no ventilation in summer. The floor was bare earth or later a thin concrete slab. 3-tier wooden bunk frames were crammed inside, with prisoners sleeping 2 or 3 to a bunk on straw mattresses that were rarely, if ever, replaced. Latrines were communal open trench facilities in separate buildings, access to which was strictly regulated by Kapos and the SS, meaning that prisoners frequently had to relieve themselves where they slept. The stench, the vermin, lice, fleas, rats, and the damp were constant features of life in the Birkenau barracks. Disease was not an accidental consequence of overcrowding. Disease was the design. A prisoner who was too sick to work was of no economic value to the camp. Selection for the gas chambers frequently targeted precisely those prisoners who had been weakened by the conditions of the barracks. The barracks and the gas chambers were not separate systems. They were two components of a single integrated process of elimination. The electrified perimeter fence at Birkenau was constructed with the same attention to detail as at the main camp. Double rows of wooden poles carried multiple strands of high-voltage wire. In between the outer and inner fences ran a strip of bare ground, the so-called neutral zone, which any prisoner approaching would be shot on sight for allegedly attempting to escape. The entire fence system was connected to a central electrical switchboard in the main guard post, allowing the current to be switched off in sections when maintenance was required or when prisoner column movements made proximity to the wire unavoidable. Guard towers were spaced along the perimeter at intervals of approximately 150 meters, each equipped with a searchlight and a machine gun on a 360-degree rotating mount. At night, the perimeter was lit continuously by floodlights positioned along the fence. The total length of the outer fence at Birkenau eventually stretched to approximately 9 kilometers. Within that perimeter, the camp at its largest enclosed dozens of subsectors and housed facilities for every stage of what the SS called the Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, a bureaucratic euphemism that meant murder. The most consequential facilities at Birkenau were the crematoria and gas chambers, and their design history is one that reflects the escalating ambition and the technical ingenuity of the SS construction apparatus. When Birkenau began operating in early 1942, there were no purpose-built gas chambers or crematoria at the new site. The first systematic killings of Jewish prisoners at Birkenau took place in 2 converted farmhouses, known among the camp inmates as the Red House and the White House, or, in the camp's internal documentation, Bunker 1 and Bunker 2. These buildings were existing Polish farmhouses on the edge of the newly established camp zone. The SS had their windows bricked up, their doors fitted with heavy bolts and rubber seals, and their interiors stripped bare. They were connected to ventilation systems of crude construction, sometimes no more than a hole in the roof or wall through which Zyklon B pellets could be poured. Outside each bunker, an open-air area surrounded by wooden fencing served as the undressing area, where arriving prisoners were told to remove their clothing before entering the shower facilities they believed awaited them. Once inside, the doors were sealed. Zyklon B pellets were introduced. Within 15 to 20 minutes, everyone inside was dead. Bodies were removed and initially buried in mass graves in the surrounding birch forest. The name Birkenau means birch tree meadow in German, before a more systematic solution for body disposal was devised. But bunkers 1 and 2 were, from the SS perspective, inadequate. Their capacity was limited. The open-air undressing process was weather-dependent and provided insufficient concealment. The body disposal method, burial in mass graves, was creating public health and logistical problems, and the buried mass graves were being noted by aerial reconnaissance as suspicious disturbances in the ground. A more permanent, more efficient, and more concealed solution was needed. The answer came in the form of the 4 large purpose-built crematoria that were constructed at Birkenau between the spring of 1942 and the spring of 1943, and which represented perhaps the most chilling architectural achievement in the history of human evil. The design of the Birkenau crematoria was a collaborative effort between Bischof's Central Construction Office, the SS Engineering Corps, and the firm of J.A. Topf und Söhne, Johann Andreas Topf and Sons, a German engineering company based in Erfurt that manufactured industrial furnaces and cremation equipment. Topf und Söhne had been supplying the SS with cremation equipment since the late 1930s, and by 1942 the company was deeply embedded in the camp system, with engineers and salesmen regularly visiting Auschwitz and other camps to assess needs and calibrate equipment. The senior Topf engineer assigned to Auschwitz was Kurt Prüfer, a technically gifted furnace designer who visited the camp on multiple occasions and made specific recommendations about the number and configuration of muffles, the individual cremation chambers within each furnace, needed to process the anticipated volume of bodies. His technical reports, preserved after the war, are extraordinary documents. They contain calculations of body processing rates, fuel consumption estimates, and technical recommendations for improving throughput. They treat human bodies as a volume problem to be solved through better engineering. Prüfer survived the war, was arrested by Soviet forces in 1946, was tried in the Soviet Union, and died in prison in 1952. The 4 crematoria at Birkenau were designated Crematoria 2, 3, 4 and 5. Crematorium 1 being the original crematorium at the main Auschwitz I camp, which had been built in 1940 and modified in 1941. Crematoria 2 and 3 were mirror images of each other, positioned on the western edge of Birkenau, and their design was the most sophisticated of the 4. Each consisted of a single integrated building that combined an underground gas chamber, disguised as a shower room, with an underground undressing room connected to the gas chamber by a corridor, and a ground-level crematorium hall containing 5 triple muffle furnaces capable of incinerating around 1,500 bodies in a 24-hour period. The undressing room was accessed from outside by a staircase leading underground. Prisoners descending those stairs saw numbered hooks on the walls. They were told to remember their hook number so they could find their clothes after the shower. The instruction was both a deception and, in retrospect, one of the most hauntingly specific details of the entire apparatus. The numbered hooks meant that prisoners arrived in the gas chamber believing they would return to collect their clothing. The hooks served no function except to maintain the illusion until the doors were sealed. The gas chamber itself was a room approximately 30 meters long and 7 meters wide, with a low concrete ceiling supported by 4 square columns running down the center of the room. Into each column, at the top, was integrated a perforated steel basket, sometimes described in the documentation as a wire mesh column or introduction device. These baskets were connected to a shaft running up through the ceiling to the ground above, where they emerged as small concrete shafts about 15 centimeters in diameter, each capped with a removable lid. When a transport of prisoners had been sealed inside the chamber and the ventilation system had been turned off, SS men wearing gas masks, specifically SSNCOs, designated as Zyklon B handlers, would approach the shafts from above, remove the caps, and pour measured quantities of Zyklon B pellets into the steel baskets below. The pellets, exposed to the warmer air inside the chamber, began releasing hydrogen cyanide gas almost immediately. Death for those nearest the columns came within minutes. Those further away died within 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the density of the gas and the physical state of the victims. The chamber was then ventilated by an electric ventilation system for approximately 30 minutes before Sonderkommando, the prisoner work squad assigned to the crematoria, entered to remove the bodies for cremation and to clean the chamber for the next transport. Crematoria 4 and 5 were surface-level structures rather than underground installations. Their gas chambers were at ground level, divided into multiple smaller chambers, and served by a simpler Zyklon B introduction system through small windows in the exterior walls. Windows that could be sealed from outside but open to allow the pellets to be poured in. These crematoria had a lower throughput capacity than crematoria 2 and 3 and were considered secondary facilities by the camp administration, though they were still capable of killing and incinerating thousands of people per week during periods of peak operation. The combined maximum theoretical capacity of all 4 Birkenau crematoria, as calculated by Topf und Söhne's own engineers and cited in Bischof's internal correspondence, was approximately 4,756 bodies per day, operating continuously at maximum efficiency. In practice, mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, and the wear on the muffle chambers from continuous use meant that actual throughput was often lower. But during the peak deportation periods, particularly during the deportation of Hungarian Jews between May and July of 1944, when 400,000 people were murdered at Auschwitz in approximately 56 days, the crematoria were pushed far beyond their design capacity. Bodies could not be cremated fast enough. The SS was forced to revert to the open-air burning pits that had first been used when the mass graves had been dug up and their contents burned in 1943 during Operation 1005, the SS program to destroy the evidence of mass killings. In the fields to the west of the crematoria, prisoners were assigned to dig large rectangular pits and to drag bodies from the gas chambers to be burned in those pits when crematorium capacity was exceeded. The smoke from the burning bodies was visible for miles. The smell was detectable even further. And still, the trains kept coming. The design of the crematoria buildings included features specifically intended to maintain the deception until the last possible moment. The roof of the underground section of crematoria 2 and 3 was covered with a thin layer of soil and grass, making the structure invisible from a distance. The chimneys, enormous cylindrical brick stacks rising from the crematorium halls, were the only visible evidence of the buildings from outside the immediate camp perimeter, and they were designed to look from a distance like the chimneys of a heating or industrial facility. The entrance to the underground section was through a stairway that led down from a small building at ground level, a building that bore no external markings identifying its function. Prisoners were told at the rail ramp that they were going to shower and be deloused before being assigned to their barracks. This lie was sustained through every step of the process: the walk from the ramp, the descent into the undressing room, the numbered hooks, the fake shower heads that were set into the ceiling of the gas chamber but were never connected to a water supply, the guards' calm instructions to remember their hook numbers and make their way to the showers in the next room. The architecture of deception was as deliberate as the architecture of killing. Every element was designed to prevent panic, because panic slowed the process. The fake shower heads in the gas chambers of crematoria 2 and 3 are perhaps the single most chilling detail in the entire physical design of Auschwitz. They were manufactured from perforated metal and installed in the ceiling of the gas chamber in rows, precisely as shower heads would appear in a genuine shower facility. They were not connected to any water pipe. They served no function except to make the room look like a shower room. Their installation required a specific decision. Someone had to decide that fake shower heads should be included. Someone had to order them. Someone had to manufacture them. Someone had to install them. These were not accidental features. They were design elements, as deliberate as any other feature of the building, selected and implemented by people who understood exactly what the room was going to be used for, and who chose to include the fake shower heads because they made the room look convincing. The person or people who made that decision, who held a pencil over a technical drawing and wrote "shower heads, dummy," or who made a verbal request to a metal worker, bear a particular kind of responsibility that is different from, but not less than, the responsibility of those who poured the Zyklon B. They were the designers of the deception, and their deception worked thousands of times. The very beginning of the camp's operation, transportation was central to its function. Polish political prisoners in 1940 had arrived by train from Tarnów on the existing rail line. Soviet POWs had arrived on cattle cars in the autumn of 1941. But as the mass deportation of Jewish populations from across Europe began in earnest in 1942, the existing rail access to Auschwitz, which ran to the town of Oświęcim and required prisoners to be marched or transported from the town station to the camp, became a logistical bottleneck. The distances involved, the visibility of the marches to local civilian populations, and the sheer volume of deportees that needed to be processed created pressure for a direct rail connection into the camp itself. The solution, a direct railway spur that ran from the main Auschwitz freight yard through the entrance of Auschwitz-Birkenau and deep into the interior of the camp, was planned from at least 1942 but not completed and put into operation until May 1944. The timing was not accidental. The spring of 1944 marked the beginning of the deportation of Hungary's Jewish population, the largest remaining concentrated Jewish population in Europe after the systematic destruction of Polish Jewry, and Auschwitz was designated as the primary killing site for this deportation. To handle the anticipated volume, the railway spur was completed, the platform inside the camp, the Judenrampe, or Jews' ramp, was extended and equipped with lighting for night arrivals, and additional SS personnel were assigned to conduct selections. The spur ran directly between the men's and women's camp sectors of Birkenau, terminating in a loop at a point approximately equidistant from crematoria 2 and 3 to the left and crematoria 4 and 5 to the right. The loop at the end of the spur was specifically designed to allow locomotives to uncouple and leave while the transport cars remained at the platform, reducing the time the locomotive was exposed to the camp interior and the potential for it to carry word of what it had seen to the outside world. The original arrival point for deportees, the so-called Old Ramp, had been located between the main Auschwitz camp and Birkenau, requiring those selected for death to walk or be transported by truck to the crematoria. The new internal ramp eliminated this inconvenience. Trains carrying thousands of deportees could now arrive directly inside Birkenau at a platform within walking distance of the crematoria. The distance from the end of the railway spur to the entrance of Crematorium 2 was approximately 700 metres. A prisoner arriving on a transport selected on the ramp as unfit for labour could walk from the train to their death in less than 15 minutes. The efficiency was almost architectural in its elegance. If one can apply the word elegance to a mechanism of murder, the SS could and did. Their internal correspondence about the railway spur is filled with a language of logistical satisfaction. The bottleneck had been solved. The process could now operate at maximum efficiency. The selection process that took place at the Birkenau ramp was one of the most consequential and most meticulously documented aspects of the camp's operation. When a transport arrived, the train was brought to a halt alongside the platform and the doors of the cattle cars were opened. Deportees who had been travelling for days without food, water or toilet facilities, sometimes from France, from Greece, from Hungary, from the Netherlands, stumbled out onto the platform. SS guards with dogs maintained order. Kapos directed people to form lines. Men and women were separated. Children stayed with their mothers. The elderly and the infirm were helped off the train or carried. SS doctors, sometimes including the notorious Joseph Mengele, though he was one of several doctors who conducted selections, walked along the lines, making rapid, cursory judgments about each person. Those deemed fit for labour, generally healthy men and women between the ages of 15 and 40, were directed to one side. Those deemed unfit, the elderly, the very young, pregnant women, the sick, and anyone who appeared unlikely to survive the rigours of camp labour, were directed to the other. The fit were marched to the camp to be registered, tattooed, and imprisoned. The unfit were marched or driven to the crematoria, where they were killed, without ever appearing in the camp's records. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, an estimated 70 to 80% of every transport was sent directly to the gas chambers without being registered. This figure, 70 to 80%, is crucial for understanding the true scale of Auschwitz's operation. The camp's registration books, which survived the war, record approximately 400,000 individual prisoners who were tattooed and assigned prisoner numbers over the course of the camp's operation. This number alone would make Auschwitz one of the deadliest institutions in human history, but the registered prisoners represent only 20 to 30% of the total who arrived. The remaining 70 to 80%, the majority of every transport comprising the overwhelming majority of the camp's victims, were murdered and disposed of without ever being counted in the camp's official statistics. Their names do not appear in prisoner registration books. Their deaths are invisible in the SS's official bookkeeping. They are the missing millions present in the total death toll of Auschwitz, estimated by historians at between 1.1 and 1.5 million people, but absent from the documentary record that the SS itself maintained. This was itself a design feature. The SS deliberately chose not to register those designated for immediate death because registration would have created a paper trail connecting the arrivals to the deaths. The absence of records was not an oversight. It was an administrative choice that served the purpose of concealment. Beyond the gas chambers and crematoria, Birkenau contained an enormous warehouse complex that the prisoners called Canada, a name that reflected the inmates' darkly ironic sense that Canada was a land of unimaginable abundance and riches. The Canada warehouses, formerly designated as the Central Camp Property Administration storerooms, were a set of large wooden barracks buildings in the northern section of Birkenau, numbering ultimately 30 structures in the Canada II complex, in addition to a smaller Canada I facility near the main camp. These warehouses stored the possessions seized from murdered deportees: clothing, shoes, glasses, prosthetics, hairbrushes, children's toys, wedding rings, gold teeth extracted from the dead, foreign currency, jewellery, watches, photographs, and food, brought for the journey by families who had expected to be resettled rather than killed. The volume of material that passed through the Canada warehouses was staggering. When Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, they found in the Canada warehouses approximately 370,000 men's suits, 837,000 women's garments, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and 7 tons of human hair compressed into bales for shipment to textile factories. And this represented what the SS had not yet managed to ship out before the liberation. A fraction of what had passed through the warehouses over the camp's 4 years of operation. The Canada warehouses were staffed by prisoners who were considered by their fellow inmates to be among the most fortunate in the camp, not because the work was easy, but because access to the mountains of confiscated property meant access to food, warm clothing, and the small items of value that could be used for barter within the camp's informal economy. Canada prisoners could sometimes smuggle food to friends in other parts of the camp. They could obtain medicine from the stored possessions of murdered deportees. They knew things that other prisoners did not know because they saw the sheer volume of what was arriving and being processed. Some of them understood with terrible clarity what was happening on the ramp and in the crematoria. Their testimonies, those who survived, are among the most vivid and specific accounts of life and death at Auschwitz. The third component of the Auschwitz complex, Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz, represented yet another dimension of the camp's design: the integration of mass murder with industrial exploitation. Monowitz was built to serve a specific industrial partnership between the SS and IG Farben, one of the largest chemical corporations in Germany and the world. IG Farben had been seeking a site to build a new Bühnewerke, a synthetic rubber and fuel production plant, and had identified the Auschwitz area as ideal in the autumn of 1940, before the full scope of the camp's development had been settled. The area offered access to coal from the Upper Silesian coalfields, water from the Vistula and Soa rivers, and, critically, a virtually unlimited supply of free labour from the concentration camp. The relationship between IG Farben and the SS was contractual. The company paid the SS a daily fee for each prisoner worker, set at approximately 3 to 4 Reichsmarks per day for unskilled labour. The SS retained the fee. The prisoners received nothing and were worked under conditions that the company's own managers privately acknowledged caused rapid physical deterioration and death. Construction of the Bühne plant began in April 1941, with Auschwitz prisoners marched daily from the main camp on a journey of 7 kilometers each way to the construction site. The daily march, the work itself, which involved heavy construction labour, concrete pouring and chemical processing work under SS and company supervision, and the return march accounted for an 18 to 20-hour working day during construction. The attrition among the prisoner workers was catastrophic. Within months, it became clear that the daily march was killing prisoners at a rate that reduced the productivity of the workforce, and that a more stable housing arrangement was needed. The solution was a new camp built adjacent to the Bühne plant, named Monowitz, after the nearby village of Monowitz, Auschwitz. 3 Monowitz was established in October 1942 as an independent subcamp, eventually housing around 10,000 prisoners who were owned, in effect, by E.G. Farben for the purpose of building and operating the synthetic rubber plant. The conditions at Monowitz were designed by the SS and tacitly endorsed by I.G. Farben's management to keep prisoners alive just long enough to be useful. When a prisoner's physical condition deteriorated beyond the point where they could continue working, they were transferred back to Birkenau and selected for the gas chambers. IG Farben's plant managers observed and participated in these selection processes. Company engineers walked through prisoner barracks with SS officers, pointing out those whose condition made them unfit for continued work. This was not a matter of passive knowledge. It was active participation in a system that was killing people as a byproduct of industrial production. The Buna plant, which cost IG Farben approximately 1 billion Reichsmarks and consumed the lives of tens of thousands of slave labourers, never produced a single kilogram of synthetic rubber before the war ended. The plant was evacuated in January 1945 without ever reaching production capacity. The investment was lost. The workers who had built it were either dead or on death marches. Around Auschwitz I and Birkenau, the SS established a network of approximately 45 additional subcamps that housed prisoner workers for various industrial and agricultural operations across the region. These subcamps ranged from small facilities housing a few dozen prisoners to larger installations holding several thousand. They served coal mines, armaments factories, chemical plants, and agricultural estates. In each case, the same basic model applied. Prisoners were rented from the SS, worked to exhaustion, and returned to the main camp when they could no longer be productive. The network of subcamps transformed the entire Upper Silesian industrial region into an SS-operated economic empire built on slave labour and connected to the killing machinery at Birkenau. The subcamps were, in a very real sense, extensions of Auschwitz's design, satellite nodes in a system whose central hub was the Birkenau crematoria. The question of what those who lived and worked near Auschwitz knew about its operations has been debated since the war. The short answer is that knowledge was widespread, though its nature and specificity varied. The smoke from the burning pits was visible across the region. The smell of burning flesh was detectable in the town of Oswiecim. Local railway workers saw the deportation trains arriving. Polish civilians displaced from the Interessengebiet had been eyewitnesses to the early stages of the camp's construction. Escaped prisoners, including a small number who managed to reach the outside world and report on what they had seen, provided detailed accounts that were in Allied hands by 1942 and 1943. The Werber-Wetzler report, compiled by two Slovak Jewish prisoners, Rudolf Werber and Alfred Wetzler, who escaped from Auschwitz in April 1944, provided an extraordinarily detailed and accurate account of the camp's structure, its crematoria, and the scale of its killing operations. The report reached Jewish leaders in Slovakia, Hungary, and eventually Allied governments and the Vatican by the late spring of 1944. Its distribution led to a brief, agonized discussion among Allied officials and Jewish leaders about whether Auschwitz and the railway lines leading to it should be bombed. The decision ultimately was not to bomb, a decision that has been debated with passion and pain ever since by historians and survivors alike. The Werber-Wetzler report and the question of Allied bombing bring us to one of the most contested dimensions of the Auschwitz story, the question of what could have been done to stop it. The camp was photographed by Allied reconnaissance aircraft on multiple occasions during 1944, and the photographs showed the crematoria, the gas chambers, and even the railway spur clearly visible from the air. Analysts at the time, focused on their primary mission of targeting industrial facilities, did not identify the camp's killing infrastructure in those photographs. But when historians re-examined the same photographs decades later, the crematoria, the undressing rooms, and even the columns of prisoners approaching the gas chambers were visible. Whether bombing the crematoria or the rail lines would have saved significant numbers of lives, given that replacement facilities or alternative routes could have been established, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. But the fact that the option was discussed and rejected at a moment when the machinery of Auschwitz was operating at its peak efficiency is a historical reality that carries its own weight. The Sonderkommando, the Special Commandos, were the prisoner work squads who were forced to operate the crematoria at Birkenau. They were, in the SS's deliberately cruel formulation, made complicit in the killing of their fellow prisoners. The Sonderkommando were given special food rations, access to the possessions in the Canada warehouses, and separate housing from the main prisoner population. They were also isolated from the other prisoners as much as possible, a deliberate policy designed to prevent them from passing on what they knew about the crematoria's operations. They were periodically killed, replaced by new Sonderkommando drawn from incoming transports, specifically to prevent any individual from accumulating too much knowledge and too many years of survival. The turnover of Sonderkommando members was built into the system as an administrative procedure, as bureaucratically routine as any other aspect of camp management. A Sonderkommando prisoner might survive for 6 months or a year before being included in a routine liquidation of his cohort, his replacement drawn from the next arriving transport. The psychological weight of the work imposed on these men Burying or burning the bodies of their own families, cleaning the gas chambers used to kill people from their own communities, was something the SS calibrated with precision. They were useful for their labor and their knowledge, and they were dangerous for exactly the same reasons. Process had not fully destroyed before the ash was taken away to be dumped in the Vistula or Soa rivers or spread as fertilizer in the surrounding fields. Within the isolation of the crematoria, some Sonderkommando members made extraordinary efforts to document and preserve evidence of what they were witnessing. The most remarkable of these efforts produced what are now known as the Scrolls of Auschwitz, written accounts and documentation produced by Sonderkommando members and buried in the grounds near the crematoria with the hope that they might be found after the war. Some of these documents were indeed found, buried in jars and metal containers in the soil near Crematorium 3, when construction workers at the Auschwitz memorial site were excavating in the years after the war. The scrolls include detailed accounts of the killing process, names and numbers of arrivals, and the voices of men who knew they were likely to die but wanted the world to know what they had seen. The most significant of these accounts was written by Zalman Gradowski, a Lithuanian Jewish man who was brought to Auschwitz in February 1943 and assigned to the Sonderkommando. His writings, buried near Crematorium 3 and recovered in 1945, describe the arrival of deportees from his own community, people he recognized, neighbors and acquaintances, and their murder in the gas chambers. The emotional intensity of his account is matched by its historical precision. He wrote down what he saw with the deliberateness of a man who understood that his testimony was the only record that would exist. The rebellion of the Sonderkommando on October 7, 1944, was one of the very few acts of organized armed resistance that took place at Auschwitz, and its story is both inspiring and tragic in equal measure. By the autumn of 1944, the Sonderkommando at Birkenau had grown to approximately 700 men, a larger cohort than usual, reflecting the enormous volume of killing during the Hungarian Jewish deportations of the summer. With the Allied advance making German defeat increasingly apparent, the surviving Sonderkommando members had good reason to believe that their usefulness to the SS was coming to an end. Rumours of imminent liquidation of the Sonderkommando cohort circulated through the crematoria. A small group of prisoners, including members of the underground resistance network that operated within the camp, had been secretly acquiring explosives and weapons smuggled piece by piece from the Union Munitions Factory, a weapons production subcamp where female prisoners worked and were able to steal small quantities of gunpowder and other materials. The plan was ambitious: to blow up all 4 Birkenau crematoria simultaneously, using explosives that had been assembled and hidden in the crematoria buildings, and to use the confusion of the explosions to facilitate a mass escape. The escape would be coordinated with an armed uprising in the main camp and assistance from Polish partisan groups who were supposedly positioned in the surrounding forest. In practice, the uprising was only partially executed. Information that the SS was preparing an immediate liquidation of a large portion of the Sonderkommando, which did in fact take place on that date, with 300 men already selected for killing, triggered a premature outbreak of the rebellion. At Crematorium 4, the Sonderkommando attacked SS guards with hammers, axes, stones, and a small quantity of grenades, and managed to set the building on fire using gunpowder that had been hidden in the structure. The fire at Crematorium 4 was significant. It damaged the facility sufficiently that it never operated again. At Crematorium 2, a section of the Sonderkommando cut through the perimeter wire and made a run for the outside, reaching an old farmhouse in which they barricaded themselves. SS reinforcements surrounded the building. All of the escaping prisoners were killed in the firefight or captured and subsequently executed. Crematorium 2 and 3 continued to operate, and the uprising at Crematorium 4 was suppressed within hours. 451 Sonderkommando members were killed during and immediately after the uprising. But the women who had smuggled the explosives into the crematoria were identified. 4 Jewish women who worked at the Union Munitions Factory, Ella Gartner, Regina Saferstein, Esther Weichblum, and Rosa Robota, were arrested, tortured to obtain the names of their accomplices, and executed. They were hanged in front of assembled prisoners in January 1945, in one of the last public executions at Auschwitz, before the camp was evacuated. Rosa Robota, before her execution, reportedly smuggled a final message to a contact in the camp underground. Hazak Ve'amatz. Be strong and brave. She was 23 years old. The medical dimension of Auschwitz represents another deliberate architectural and institutional choice. The decision to transform medicine, the discipline devoted to healing, into an instrument of killing and exploitation. The Auschwitz camp system employed numerous SS physicians, and their roles were multiple and deeply interconnected. At the most fundamental level, SS doctors conducted the selections at the Birkenau ramp, making the life or death judgments that determined who went to the gas chambers and who entered the camp. They did so not as physicians applying clinical criteria, but as administrators of an industrial killing process, making snap decisions about physical fitness based on a cursory glance at each new arrival. The selection process took approximately 20 seconds per person. In those 20 seconds, an SS doctor would determine, based on the appearance of the individual before him, whether they would live or die. The fact that these men were physicians, trained to preserve life, bound by a professional ethic of care, and that they were conducting these selections made them, in a specific and important sense, the most complete embodiment of the Nazi inversion of civilized values. Josef Mengele, who arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943 and remained until the camp's evacuation in January 1945, became the most infamous of the Auschwitz SS physicians, not primarily because he conducted selections, which all SS doctors did, but because of his personal enthusiasm for and investment in the work, and because of the medical experiments he conducted on camp prisoners. Mengele had an academic background in anthropology and genetics, having completed a doctoral thesis on racial differences in jaw structure and having done postdoctoral work in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology. He saw Auschwitz as, among other things, an unparalleled research opportunity, access to a population of human subjects that medical ethics would never otherwise permit, in conditions where the usual constraints of consent, professional ethics, and the risk of legal consequences did not apply. He conducted experiments on twins, collecting hundreds of twin pairs from incoming transports and subjecting them to a range of procedures including comparative measurements, blood transfers between twins, deliberately induced disease, and surgical interventions, in an attempt to study heredity and advance the Nazi racial science that claimed to provide a scientific basis for the hierarchy of human races. He also conducted experiments on people with achondroplasia, eye color variations, and a range of other physical characteristics that interested him from a genetic or anthropological perspective. His experiments caused immense suffering, produced no scientifically valid results, and killed many of his subjects. After the camp's evacuation, Mengele escaped to South America, evading capture for the rest of his life. He died in 1979 in Bertioga, Brazil, having drowned while swimming in the sea, never having faced trial for his crimes. He was 67 years old. The fate of the Auschwitz complex as the war turned against Germany reveals another dimension of the camp's design. Its planners had made no provision for the possibility of defeat. There was no protocol for the orderly shutdown of a killing facility. There was no plan for the disposal of the evidence of mass murder that could realistically be implemented in the time available. When it became clear in the autumn of 1944 that the Soviet advance was unstoppable and that Auschwitz itself would eventually fall behind Soviet lines, the SS began a frantic and only partially successful effort to destroy the evidence of what had taken place there. The crematoria themselves, the most incriminating physical evidence, were the primary target. Following the Sonderkommando uprising in October 1944, which had already destroyed Crematorium 4, Himmler ordered the cessation of killing operations at Birkenau on November 2, 1944. The gas chambers of Crematoria 2 and 3 were stripped of their Zyklon B introduction equipment, their furnaces were partially dismantled, and the structures were then blown up with explosives in January 1945. Crematoria 5, the last operating crematorium, was blown up on January 26, 1945, the day before Soviet forces arrived. The Canada warehouses were set on fire on the night of January 20, 1945, and burned for days, though the fire was only partially successful in destroying their contents. Vast quantities of prisoner possessions that had been prepared for shipment remained identifiable in the ruins. The camp's records, thousands of files and documents maintained by the SS administration, were gathered and partially burned or shredded in the days before liberation. but the destruction was incomplete. A significant portion of the documentary record survived, either because it was hidden, because SS personnel fled before completing the destruction, or because the advancing Soviet forces moved faster than the SS had anticipated. The surviving records, combined with the physical evidence of the camp's structures, the testimony of survivors, and the confessions and testimony of SS personnel captured and tried after the war, provide the evidentiary basis for the historical account of Auschwitz. The incompleteness of the SE's destruction effort is itself historically significant. It suggests the degree of panic and confusion that attended the camp's final weeks. The SS, so meticulous in administration during the camp's operation, were incapable of organized concealment when the moment of reckoning arrived. The SS began the evacuation of Auschwitz's surviving prisoner population on January 17th and 18th, 1945. At that point, approximately 67,000 prisoners remained in the Auschwitz complex, those who had survived years of imprisonment, selections, hunger, disease, and brutal labor. The evacuation took the form of forced marches conducted in extreme winter conditions, with temperatures dropping as low as -20 degrees Celsius. Columns of prisoners, many in severely weakened physical condition, were marched west toward Germany over distances of 50 to 60 kilometers or more before being loaded onto open freight cars for further transport to concentration camps in Germany proper. Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, Flossenbürg, and Dachau, among others. Those who fell behind on the marches, unable to walk, physically collapsed, or simply too exhausted to continue, were shot by the SS guards who followed the columns. The number of prisoners who died during the Auschwitz death marches is estimated at between 9,000 and 15,000, in addition to those who subsequently died in the camps to which the survivors were transferred. The death marches were the final chapter of Auschwitz's killing, conducted not in gas chambers but on the snowy roads of Upper Silesia, by guards who killed with rifles rather than Zyklon B, but with the same essential motivation: the elimination of people the regime had decided were worthless and dangerous. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front reached the Auschwitz complex. The first camps they encountered were the sub-camps at the periphery, then the main camps themselves. What they found defied the capacity of even hardened combat veterans to process. At Birkenau, the ruins of the crematoria were still smoking. The electrified fences were silent. The power had been cut. The barracks were filled with thousands of prisoners too weak to have been evacuated, those the SS had simply left behind to die, or whom the SS had been unable to process in the chaos of the final days. Soviet medical personnel and film crews documented what they found. The storage buildings, half burned, still contained hundreds of thousands of items of clothing and possessions. The surviving prisoners, approximately 7,000 people, a small fraction of the Auschwitz complex's original population, were in states of extreme malnutrition, disease, and physical deterioration that shocked the Soviet doctors who tried to treat them. Many died in the days and weeks after liberation, too damaged by years of imprisonment and the final weeks of evacuation-related privation to recover. The Soviet film crews recorded footage of the survivors that has been shown around the world for 80 years since. Gaunt figures in striped uniforms staring at the cameras with expressions that have no English word that captures them adequately. The date January 27, 1945 has since been designated International Holocaust Remembrance Day by the United Nations, commemorated annually in 193 countries as a day of reflection on the Holocaust and on the broader dangers of genocide, hatred, and the dehumanization of human beings. The designation reflects the recognition that Auschwitz, in its scale and its design, represents not only a specific historical catastrophe, but a permanent warning about the capacity of human civilization to organize itself in the service of mass murder when institutional safeguards, moral traditions, and the basic recognition of shared humanity are systematically dismantled. The question of justice, of what happened to those who designed, built, administered, and operated Auschwitz, is one that the post-war world struggled with and by many measures failed to adequately resolve. The scale and complexity of the crime made comprehensive accountability impossible. The number of individuals who bore some degree of culpability for what happened at Auschwitz, From the architects who drew the crematoria blueprints to the railway officials who managed the deportation schedules, from the industrial managers who operated the slave labor camps to the SS guards who conducted selections, ran into the tens of thousands. It was not possible to try them all. What the post-war legal system managed was partial, selective, and in many cases inadequate to the scale of the crimes being addressed. But the prosecutions that did occur established important precedents and documented the crimes of Auschwitz with a thoroughness that has been invaluable for historical understanding. Rudolf Höss, the first and longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz, was captured by British forces in March 1946. He had been living under a false identity in northern Germany, working as a farm labourer. British interrogators identified him through intelligence work and arrested him at the farm. Höss initially denied his identity, but quickly broke under interrogation and agreed to cooperate. He was transferred to Poland, where he was tried by the Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw in March 1947. At his trial, Höss provided detailed, precise, and largely unrepentant testimony about his role in the operation of Auschwitz. He confirmed the death toll, described the killing procedures, and provided insight into the administrative structures of the camp system that has been invaluable for historians. His manner in the dock was that of a bureaucrat accounting for his work, methodical, precise, matter-of-fact. He seemed to struggle more with the organizational details he was being asked to recall than with any sense of guilt or moral horror at what those details described. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. On April 16, 1947, he was hanged on a specially constructed gallows erected adjacent to the gas chamber of Crematorium I at Auschwitz I, on the grounds of the camp he had commanded, near the building he had helped to design, steps from where he had ordered tens of thousands of people to be murdered. He was 46 years old. His execution on the site of his crimes was a deliberate choice by the Polish authorities, an act of justice that carried its own symbolism. The other camps, an attempt to ensure that the systematic abuse of research subjects witnessed in the concentration camps could never be repeated under the guise of scientific inquiry. Karl Kloberg, the SS physician who had conducted mass sterilization experiments on women in Block 10 of Auschwitz I, had a post-war fate that illustrated the limitations of Cold War-era justice. Kloberg was captured by Soviet forces and tried in the Soviet Union, where he was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment in 1948. In 1955, following the normalization of diplomatic relations between West Germany and the Soviet Union, Kloberg was among a group of German prisoners released and returned to West Germany as part of a prisoner exchange. Extraordinarily, Kloberg returned to Germany and immediately began boasting to journalists about his wartime research, apparently believing that in the new Germany of the 1950s, his crimes would be treated with the same pragmatic amnesia that characterized much of the denazification process. He was arrested by West German authorities in 1955, following public outcry from survivor organizations, but he died in his prison cell in August 1957, before his trial could begin, taking with him the full details of his experimental methodology and his victim lists. The architects who designed the Auschwitz crematoria faced a legal reckoning that was, by any measure, strikingly inadequate to the nature of their contribution to the killing process. SS Untersturmführer Fritz Ertl and SS Untersturmführer Walter Dejako, who had personally drawn the blueprints for crematoria 2 and 3, the primary killing facilities at Birkenau, were captured after the war and were eventually tried in Austria in 1972. By this point, more than 25 years had passed since the end of the war. The Austrian legal system, which had long maintained the convenient fiction that Austria was itself a victim of Nazi Germany, rather than a willing participant in it, conducted the trial in a political atmosphere that was far from conducive to conviction. Both Ertl and Dejako were acquitted. The Austrian court found that the prosecution had not established beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants had known at the time of their drafting work that the facilities they were designing were intended for the murder of human beings, a finding that required a considerable willful suspension of disbelief given the content of the surviving documentation. Ertl died in Austria in 1982. Dejako died in Austria in 1993. Neither ever served a day in prison for their role in designing the gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Karl Bischoff, the head of the SS Central Construction Office at Auschwitz, the man who had overseen the entire construction project, who had signed off on the blueprints, who had corresponded with Top von Sohner about cremation capacity, was captured by American forces after the war. He was held for a period and questioned, but was never formally tried for his role in the construction of the crematoria and gas chambers. He was released in the late 1940s and returned to civilian life in Germany. He worked as a civil engineer in West Germany and died in Bremen in 1950, of natural causes, at home, in his bed, having faced no legal accountability whatsoever for his role in designing and overseeing the construction of the most lethal killing facility in human history. The contrast with the fate of Rudolf Höss, who was hanged on the grounds of the camp he commanded, is stark and is itself a form of historical commentary on where the legal systems of the post-war era chose to assign blame. Oswald Pohl, the head of the SS Main Economic Administrative Office, the WVHA, which oversaw the economic operations of the entire concentration camp system, including Auschwitz, was tried at Nuremberg in the Pohl case, also known as the WVHA trial, which ran from April to November 1947. Pohl's office had administered the slave labour contracts with I.G. Farben and other companies, had managed the Canada warehouses and the financial exploitation of murdered prisoners' possessions, and had overseen the SS construction apparatus that built the crematoria. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. Pohl was hanged at Landsberg prison on June 8, 1951, 6 years after the war's end. He maintained until the end that he had been merely an administrator following orders and that the moral responsibility lay with those above him, Himmler and Hitler, both of whom were dead and beyond the reach of any tribunal. The most comprehensive legal reckoning for the specific crimes of Auschwitz, as opposed to the broader crimes of the Nazi regime tried at Nuremberg, came through a series of trials conducted in West Germany between 1963 and 1965. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, formerly Strafsache gegen Mulker und andere, criminal case against Mulker and others, was prosecuted by Frankfurt State Prosecutor Fritz Bauer and brought 22 defendants to trial who had served in various capacities at Auschwitz. The defendants included former SS guards, administrative personnel, and medical staff. The trial lasted 20 months and heard testimony from over 350 witnesses, including many survivors who described in precise and devastating detail what they had seen and experienced. The trial produced convictions against 17 of the 22 defendants, with sentences ranging from 3 years and 3 months to life imprisonment. But the sentences were widely criticized as inadequate. A life sentence in West Germany at that time meant a minimum of 12 years before parole eligibility, and many of the defendants were released well before their sentences were completed. Robert Mulker, who had served as adjutant of Auschwitz and who was convicted of participating in selections and deportations that led to hundreds of murders, was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was released after serving only 3 years due to poor health. He died in 1969. Wilhelm Boger, a particularly brutal SS officer who had invented a torture device known as the Boger swing, a metal bar over which prisoners were suspended and beaten, was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 5 years. He remained in prison until his death in 1977. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial had an enormous cultural impact in West Germany beyond its legal outcomes. For a generation of young Germans who had been born after the war or were children during it, the trial was a revelation. Detailed, unavoidable evidence of what their parents and grandparents had been involved in, presented in a court of law in their own country, reported daily in the press. The playwright Peter Weiss was deeply influenced by his observation of the trial proceedings and transformed the testimony he heard into the investigation, Ermittlung, a documentary theatre piece that condensed the testimony of witnesses and defendants into a stark dramatic form and was performed in multiple countries in 1965. The play has been revived many times since and remains one of the most powerful artistic responses to the Holocaust. The Frankfurt trial also contributed to a broader shift in West German society's relationship to its Nazi past, a shift that was still incomplete and still contested in the 1960s, but that was moving, slowly and painfully, toward a more honest confrontation with historical responsibility. The last commandant of Auschwitz, Richard Baer, who replaced the penultimate commandant Arthur Lieberhenschel in May 1944 and commanded the camp until its evacuation, had an extraordinary post-war career as a fugitive. Baer managed to avoid identification for 15 years after the war's end, living under a series of false identities in the Hamburg area, working in the forestry industry. He was finally identified and arrested in December 1960, partly as a result of investigative work stimulated by the arrest and trial of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina earlier that year, which had focused international attention on the network of former SS officers still living freely in Germany and elsewhere. Baer was arrested and charged with the murders of thousands of prisoners during his command, but he died in Frankfurt's Prungersheim prison in June 1963 before his trial began, of what was officially described as heart failure. He was 49 years old. As with Kloberg, his death before trial meant that he never answered in court for his crimes, and that certain details of Auschwitz's final months that only he fully knew died with him. The fate of Adolf Eichmann, the SS lieutenant colonel who served as the head of the section of the Reich Main Security Office responsible for managing the deportation of Jews to the death camps, including Auschwitz, became one of the most significant trials in the history of international law. Eichmann had escaped to Argentina after the war using a false identity, living as Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires. He was tracked down by Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, and in May 1960 was abducted from the street in Buenos Aires in an operation that violated Argentine sovereignty but captured the attention of the world. He was brought to Israel, tried in Jerusalem before a specially constituted court under the Israeli Nazis and Nazi collaborators' punishment law, and found guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The Jerusalem trial, which ran from April to December 1961, produced an extraordinary documentary record. Eichmann testified at length about his role in the final solution, providing detail about the administrative mechanisms of deportation to Auschwitz and the other death camps that supplemented and confirmed the documentary evidence. He was sentenced to death and hanged at Ramla prison on May 31, 1962, the only execution carried out by the civilian government of Israel before or since. The journalist Hannah Arendt, who covered the Eichmann trial for The New Yorker, famously characterized Eichmann as representing what she called the banality of evil. Not a monster, not someone driven by deep hatred or psychopathic personality, but an ordinary bureaucrat who had participated in genocide through the application of professional competence to administrative tasks without engaging his moral conscience at any significant point. The phrase has been controversial among historians ever since, but it has captured something real about Auschwitz: the degree to which the camp was built and operated by people who were, in most respects, ordinary. Ordinary engineers, ordinary administrators, ordinary guards. The evil they perpetrated was not ordinary, but the people who perpetrated it largely were, and that is perhaps the most disturbing and consequential lesson of the entire story. The physical site of Auschwitz today, then the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, established by the Polish Parliament in 1947 and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979, receives approximately 2 million visitors per year. The main camp at Auschwitz I has been preserved largely as it was at Liberation, its brick barracks converted into museum exhibition spaces that house enormous quantities of the physical evidence found at Liberation. The mountains of shoes, the piles of eyeglasses, the human hair, the prosthetics, the children's clothing. The hair, 7 tons of it, compressed into bales and found in the Canada warehouses, is displayed behind glass in a long case that confronts visitors with a reality that statistics and text cannot fully convey. At Birkenau, the site is largely open to the elements. The wooden barracks of the early period are gone, leaving only their brick chimney stubs standing in rows across the marshy ground like a forest of memorials. The brick barracks of the later construction periods survive, as does the notorious gatehouse with its arched entrance through which the railway spur ran. At the far end of the railway spur, approximately 2 kilometres from the gatehouse, stand the ruins of crematoria 2 and 3, twisted concrete and broken masonry, deliberately demolished by the SS but never fully destroyed, lying as they fell on January 20th, 1945. Survivors and visitors place stones and flowers on the ruins. International Holocaust remembrance ceremonies are held there annually. The architects of Auschwitz, in both the physical and metaphorical sense, built something that they hoped would not survive their own victory. They built the crematoria as industrial facilities that would outlast the war by generations, assuming they would win. They built the documentation in bureaucratic files that they assumed would be destroyed if defeat came. They built a system of concealment and deception that they believed would prevent the outside world from ever fully understanding what was happening inside. In every one of these assumptions, they were wrong. The crematoria ruins survive. The documents survived. The witnesses survived. Not all of them. Not most of them. But enough. And the understanding of what Auschwitz was, how it worked, and who built it has grown more detailed and more certain with every decade since the liberation, not less. The designers of Auschwitz believed they were building for eternity. What they actually built was the most thoroughly documented and studied crime in human history. A crime whose details have been examined, verified, and taught to successive generations, precisely because the attempt to conceal it was ultimately unsuccessful. The populations that were brought to Auschwitz-Birkenau came from virtually every corner of occupied Europe, and the story of how each community was targeted, concentrated, and deported reveals the administrative machinery of the final solution in operation across different national contexts. Polish Jews, who constituted the largest national group among Auschwitz's victims, had been subjected to systematic persecution since the German occupation of September 1939. The establishment of ghettos in Warsaw, Łódź, Kraków, and dozens of smaller cities had concentrated Poland's pre-war Jewish population of over 3 million into enclosed, deliberately undersupplied urban zones, where disease and starvation began the work of killing before the gas chambers were ready. The deportations from the Polish ghettos to the Auschwitz complex began in earnest in 1942 and continued through 1944, drawing from communities across Silesia, the General Government Territory, and the annexed territories of Western Poland. By the time the deportations from Poland were complete, Polish Jews had accounted for approximately half of Auschwitz's total victims. Roughly 300,000 to 400,000 people brought to the camp from Polish communities that had existed for centuries and were, within the space of a few years, almost completely annihilated. The deportations from Western Europe, from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and later from Italy, operated through a different administrative mechanism, one that relied heavily on the cooperation of local administrative authorities and on the German belief that the populations being deported could be persuaded, through careful use of deceptive language, to cooperate with the process of their own destruction. In France, the Vichy government's collaboration with German deportation demands has been the subject of intense national debate since the war. The Wälder Hiv roundup of July 16th to 17th, 1942, in which more than 13,000 Jews were arrested by French police in Paris and held in the Vélodrome d'Hiver sports stadium before being deported, approximately 4,000 of them children, represented one of the most visible acts of collaborative participation in the Holocaust. The deportees from France arrived at Auschwitz on trains that had travelled for days across the territory of occupied Europe, in cattle cars sealed from outside with no food or water. The proportion of French deportees selected for immediate gassing upon arrival at Birkenau was particularly high. Many transports arrived with mortality already having occurred during the journey, and the survivors were frequently in a condition of extreme physical deterioration. From the Netherlands, the deportations were coordinated through a similarly administrative apparatus, with the German-installed Sicherheitspolizei working alongside Dutch civil service structures to identify, register and collect the country's Jewish population. The Dutch railroad company NS, Nederlandse Spoorwegen, transported approximately 107,000 Jewish and Roma deportees to the German border on trains that were then handed over to German railway operators for the final journey east. Approximately 5,000 Dutch Jews survived the war. The rest died, the majority at Auschwitz. Among those transported from the Netherlands was a 13-year-old girl named Anne Frank, who was arrested with her family in August 1944 from the Prinsengracht building in Amsterdam, where they had been hiding for over 2 years, transported to Auschwitz and subsequently transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she died of typhus in February 1945, weeks before the camp's liberation. Her diary, preserved by Miep Gess and published after the war by her father Otto, the only member of the Frank family who survived, became the most widely read personal account of the Holocaust and introduced millions of readers around the world to the human reality behind the statistics. The Greek Jewish communities were among those deported to Auschwitz in 1943 and 1944, in circumstances that illustrated the pan-European reach of the deportation machinery. The Jewish community of Thessaloniki, Salonika, was one of the oldest and largest in Europe. with roots stretching back to the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. The community spoke Ladino, a form of Spanish maintained across 5 centuries in the Ottoman Empire and then in Greece. The German military occupation of Thessaloniki, beginning in April 1941, brought the same progressive sequence of persecution that was unfolding elsewhere in Europe: registration, identification markings, ghetto confinement, seizure of property. Between March and August 1943, approximately 50,000 of Thessaloniki's Jewish community were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 19 transports, each carrying approximately 2,500 people. The journey from Thessaloniki to Auschwitz took approximately 11 to 14 days through the Balkans and Central Europe. The trains carried people who had been told they were being resettled in Poland. They arrived at Birkenau, where selection took place, and approximately 90% were immediately sent to the gas chambers. The Thessaloniki community, which had numbered approximately 56,000 before the war, was destroyed in the space of 5 months. Perhaps a few thousand survived. The 500-year-old Ladino-speaking culture of Sephardic Thessaloniki was eliminated from the world within a single year. The fate of Roma and Sinti people at Auschwitz represents another dimension of the camp's operation that has received significantly less historical attention than the murder of Jewish victims, despite the severity and systematic nature of what happened. The Nazis classified Roma and Sinti people alongside Jews as racially inferior and targeted them for elimination under the same ideological framework. In February 1943, a section of Birkenau, Sector B1IE, was designated the Zigeunerlager, the Gypsy Camp, and approximately 23,000 Roma and Sinti people were imprisoned there over the following year and a half, in conditions that were, if possible, even worse than those in the main prisoner sectors. Families were kept together in the Gypsy Camp, unlike in the rest of Birkenau, a deliberate policy whose rationale remains somewhat unclear. Some historians have suggested it was intended to reduce the possibility of violent resistance among men who might fight if separated from their families. Others have noted that Himmler had a personal interest in the Roma and Sinti population that led to a degree of ambiguity about their fate that did not apply to Jewish prisoners. Regardless of the initial rationale, the Gypsy Camp was a place of enormous suffering, with disease, particularly noma, a gangrenous disease of the mouth associated with extreme malnutrition, ravaging the population. On the night of August 2nd to 3rd, 1944, the entire population of the Gypsy Camp, approximately 4,400 men, women and children, was ordered into the gas chambers of Birkenau in a single night of killing that liquidated the entire sector in hours. This event, known among Roma and Sinti communities as Samudarepe, the Devouring, is commemorated on August 2nd as European Roma Holocaust Memorial Day. The killing of the Gypsy Camp in a single night represented a logistical operation of considerable scale and deliberation. It required the coordination of the SS Guard structure, the Sonderkommando, and the crematoria staff to process 4,400 people in a compressed time frame. The fact that it was accomplished in a single night illustrates the operational capacity of the killing machinery at Birkenau at its peak efficiency in the summer of 1944. The Hungarian Jewish deportations of May to July 1944 represent the single largest and most concentrated period of killing at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Hungary had maintained a degree of independence within the Axis alliance until March 1944, when German forces occupied the country in response to Hungarian leader Miklos Horthy's attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. With occupation came the rapid implementation of the full apparatus of anti-Jewish persecution. Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest in person to oversee the deportations, working with Hungarian gendarmerie and government officials to register, concentrate and deport Hungary's Jewish population, which numbered approximately 750,000, making it the largest remaining Jewish community in Europe. The deportations began on May 15, 1944, and proceeded at an extraordinary rate. Within 56 days, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews had been transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 147 trains, each carrying between 3,000 and 4,000 people. Approximately 320,000 of those deportees, roughly 75%, were selected for immediate killing upon arrival. The other quarter were registered as camp prisoners or sent as labour transports to factories elsewhere in Germany. During those 56 days, the Birkenau crematoria and the open burning pits were operating at maximum capacity. The Sonderkommando numbered approximately 900 men at the peak of the Hungarian deportations, the largest it ever reached. The waiting time between the moment of arrival at the ramp and the moment of death in the gas chambers was sometimes measured in hours as transports backed up, waiting for the crematoria to complete their cycles. SS reports from this period describe the operational strain on the killing facilities in terms that are grimly clinical. It is during this period that the documentary evidence most clearly shows the SS treating the crematoria as industrial equipment, experiencing performance bottlenecks. Maintenance reports, requests for spare parts, adjustments to operating procedures to maximize throughput. The human beings being processed through those facilities appear in the documentation as volumes, numbers requiring management. This bureaucratic disappearance of the individual behind the statistic was not accidental. It was a feature of the system's design. Among the Hungarian deportees who arrived at Auschwitz during this period was a 15-year-old boy from Sziget in the Carpathian Mountains named Elie Wiesel. He arrived with his family on May 26, 1944, in a transport from the Sziget ghetto. On the ramp, Wiesel was separated from his mother and sisters, who were sent to the gas chambers, though he didn't know their fate immediately. He and his father were selected for labor and registered as camp prisoners. In the decades after the war, Wiesel would become the most widely read and widely honored survivor voice of the Holocaust. His memoir, Night, originally published in French in 1958 and subsequently translated into dozens of languages, providing a first-person account of arrival at Auschwitz, the selection on the ramp, and the experience of the camp's brutal daily reality that has become essential reading for millions of students and adults around the world. Wiesel received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986 and died in July 2016 at the age of 87, having devoted his post-war life to bearing witness and to the effort to ensure that what happened at Auschwitz was never forgotten and never denied. The children of Auschwitz deserve particular attention in any account of the camp's design and operation, because the murder of children was not an incidental consequence of a system designed primarily for adults. It was a specific, deliberate, and bureaucratically managed aspect of the killing process. Under the ideology of the final solution, Jewish children were targeted for death alongside their parents and grandparents. There was no protected category for children. There was no age below which exemption from the gas chambers was granted. On the contrary, children were among those most consistently sent to the gas chambers on arrival because they were unlikely to survive the physical demands of camp labor and were therefore immediately classified as economically useless from the SS's perspective. The instruction to mothers arriving on the ramp that those with young children should keep them close because they would receive special treatment was one of the camp's most deliberately cruel deceptions. It ensured that mothers with children who might otherwise have been selected for labor and thus for temporary survival would instead stay with their children and be selected alongside them for immediate death. The number of children killed at Auschwitz will never be precisely established, because the majority were killed without being registered. Estimates based on demographic analysis of the deportation records and the post-war population losses of affected Jewish communities suggest that approximately 200,000 children died at Auschwitz, a figure that represents perhaps 15 to 17% of the camp's total victims. These children came from every country in Europe from which Jewish communities were deported. They had been born between approximately 1905, the oldest teenagers, and 1945, when infants were still being murdered in the camp's final weeks. They had names, families, futures that were ended before they began. The few who survived, by hiding their age, by being selected for Mengelé's twin studies, or by the random chance of wartime, have given testimonies that represent the most direct individual human evidence of what Auschwitz's design in its operation actually meant for the people it consumed. The camp's design also extended to a carefully managed information environment intended to prevent knowledge of what was happening at Auschwitz from reaching the outside world. The SS imposed strict silence about the camp's killing operations. Letters from prisoners, which were permitted in carefully controlled form from the prisoner camp, though not from the transit areas where those destined for the gas chambers were held, were censored and monitored. Prisoners were warned that any attempt to communicate truthful information about camp conditions would result in severe punishment. the euphemistic language used in all official SS communications. Special treatment, resettlement, evacuation, solution was a deliberate system of coded terminology designed to allow the killing machinery to be discussed in written documents without the documents explicitly stating what was being discussed. Those who designed this linguistic framework understood that written records created legal vulnerability and that the language used in those records needed to be deniable in retrospect should the records fall into hostile hands. The Weber-Wetzler Report of 1944, the account produced by escaped prisoners Rudolf Weber and Alfred Wetzler, was the most significant breach of this information environment, and its story deserves extended telling. Weber, born Walter Rosenberg in Slovakia in 1924, had been deported to Auschwitz in June 1942 and had survived nearly 2 years in the camp by working in the Canada warehouses, where his familiarity with the operation of the crematoria gave him a precise and detailed knowledge of what was happening at the camp's core. He and Wetzler planned their escape for months, hiding for 3 days in a woodpile concealed on the outer edge of the camp perimeter, the so-called construction area outside the inner fence but within the outer guard zone, while the SS searched for them with dogs. They had lined their hiding place with tobacco soaked in gasoline to confuse the dogs' scent tracking. On April 10, 1944, they emerged and walked south through occupied Poland and Slovakia, travelling at night, relying on a network of contacts and on their own resourcefulness and courage, until they reached the relative safety of Slovakia and the Jewish community organisations operating there. Within days of reaching safety, Weber and Wetzler sat down with officials of the Jewish Council in Slovakia and dictated the report that bears their names. The Weber-Wetzler report, approximately 30 pages in its original Slovak version, described the layout of the Auschwitz complex in precise architectural detail, identified the crematoria and gas chambers, provided estimates of the numbers killed broken down by national origin, described the selection process on the ramp, and provided a clear and unambiguous account of what Auschwitz was. The report was transmitted to Jewish leaders in Hungary, who received it on April 28, 1944, 2.5 weeks before the Hungarian deportations began. Whether the Hungarian Jewish leadership could have used the information to prevent or reduce the deportations by issuing warnings, by going public, by appealing to Horthy or to Allied governments, is a question that has been argued with great intensity and genuine anguish since the war. The decisions that were made in those weeks of April and May 1944 to not immediately publish the report, to attempt quiet diplomatic interventions to avoid causing panic, have been judged harshly by some historians and defended by others as the best available options in an impossibly constrained situation. What is certain is that the report reached Allied governments, specifically the British Foreign Office and the US War Refugee Board, by mid-June 1944, by which point more than half of the total Hungarian Jewish deportations had already been completed. The report was partially published in the Western press in late June and early July 1944. The publication prompted protests from Allied governments and from Pope Pius XII that contributed, along with military pressure from the advancing Allies, to Horthy's decision to halt the deportations from Hungary in early July 1944. Approximately 170,000 Hungarian Jews who would otherwise have been deported in the summer of 1944 were alive at the war's end as a direct result of the halting of the deportations, a survival that can be traced in a direct line from the courage of Rudolf Weber and Alfred Wetzler in escaping from Auschwitz and dictating their report. It represents one of the most significant individual contributions to saving lives during the Holocaust, and it was made by two prisoners who had survived one of the most lethal environments in human history, long enough to escape and tell the world what they had seen. Weber went on to become a biochemistry professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada, testifying at war crimes trials and Holocaust denial lawsuits throughout his life. He died in Vancouver in March 2006 at the age of 81. The construction company most intimately associated with the physical building of the Auschwitz crematoria and gas chambers, Topf und Söhne of Erfurt, faced a post-war reckoning that illustrated the impunity that industrial participants in the Holocaust largely enjoyed. The company's engineers, particularly Kurt Prüfer and Ludwig Topf, had designed and installed the crematoria furnaces with full knowledge of their intended use. Prüfer, as noted, was captured by Soviet forces and died in Soviet custody in 1952. The Topf brothers, Ernst Wolfgang Topf, who had managed the company's relationship with the SS, escaped to West Germany and in 1946 established a new company, again manufacturing industrial furnaces and cremation equipment, trading on exactly the same technical expertise he had applied to designing the Auschwitz crematoria. He was never prosecuted. He died in 1979. The company itself, the original Topf und Söhne, was nationalized by the East German state and continued operating for decades under a different name. The building in Erfurt that served as the company's headquarters and design office during the war still stands. It is now a memorial and documentation center, the Topf und Söhne Memorial, which opened in 2011 and documents the company's role in the Holocaust through the extensive surviving records of its business with the SS. The discovery and analysis of surviving blueprints for the Auschwitz crematoria has been crucial to historical understanding of the camp's design intentions. The blueprints, some of which were preserved in Soviet archives captured from Auschwitz after liberation, others discovered in construction files held in German municipal archives, show the detailed technical drawings produced by Ertl, de Jaco, and their colleagues in the SS Central Construction Office. These are architectural drawings in the full professional sense. Precise scale plans with dimensions, material specifications, ventilation system layouts, and installation details. They show the undressing rooms labelled as Leichenkeller, corpse cellars, a designation that appeared in some of the early planning documents before the administrative convention of using more euphemistic language was fully established. In one particularly significant document, a letter from Bischoff to the SS Construction Management in Berlin, dated January 29, 1943. The planned throughput capacity of Crematorium 2 is described in explicit numerical terms: 1,440 bodies per 24 hours for the 5 triple muffle furnaces. The letter is written in the same bureaucratic, technical language as any construction project management correspondence. It is discussing the planned industrial incineration of 1,440 human beings per day. The contrast between the form of the document and the content of what it describes is, in a way, the clearest possible illustration of how Auschwitz was designed, not in spite of the professional norms of its designers, but through their direct application to a purpose those norms were never intended to serve. The Zyklon B supply chain itself, the industrial and commercial infrastructure that produced, packaged, transported and delivered the poison gas used to kill more than 1 million people at Auschwitz, involved multiple private companies operating through entirely legal commercial contracts with the SS-DGESH, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schädlingsbekämpfung, held the patent on Zyklon B and manufactured it at facilities in Frankfurt. The product was sold through 2 commercial intermediaries, Tesch und Stabenow of Hamburg and Hert Lingler of Frankfurt, which distributed it to the concentration camps along with other customers who used it for its stated purpose of pest control. The volume of Zyklon B delivered to Auschwitz was far in excess of what would have been required for any genuine pest control operation, a discrepancy that the commercial partners were in a position to recognize and that some of them certainly did recognize. Bruno Tesch, the founder of Tesch und Stabenow, was tried by a British military tribunal in Hamburg in 1946, found guilty of supplying poison gas, knowing it would be used to kill human beings, and was hanged in May 1946. His partner Karl Weinbacher was also convicted and hanged. The DGESH management, by contrast, escaped prosecution in the Nuremberg trials, despite having supplied the product and having representatives who visited Auschwitz and were aware of its use. The differential treatment of various links in the supply chain reflected the limitations and inconsistencies of the post-war prosecutorial effort, rather than any principled distinction in culpability. The lesson of Auschwitz's design is not that evil is inevitable or that human nature is irredeemably dark. The lesson is more specific and more actionable than that. It is that institutions can be designed for evil just as they can be designed for good. That trained professionals with ordinary motivations of career advancement, financial reward, and institutional loyalty can be induced to apply their skills to the service of mass murder if the ideological and institutional frameworks around them normalize that application. It is that bureaucratic abstraction, the language of throughput, capacity, efficiency, special treatment, can be used to conduct genocide at arm's length from the direct experience of the violence it produces. And it is that, the architecture of deception, The fake shower heads, the numbered hooks, the orchestra at the gate was as carefully designed as the architecture of killing and was essential to the killing's operational success. These are lessons not only about the Holocaust. They are lessons about how human institutions can be corrupted and how vigilance against that corruption is a permanent and necessary obligation of every generation that inherits civilization. The Auschwitz-Birkenau complex was not built in a day, and its transformation from a collection of derelict barracks into the most lethal site in human history was not the product of a single decision. It took years of planning, construction, administrative development, and institutional evolution. It took architects and engineers, furnace designers and railway officials, chemists and administrators, guards and capos and doctors. It took a political system that had spent a decade systematically dismantling the ethical, legal, and social frameworks that might otherwise have prevented it. And it took the ordinary human capacity for rationalization, the ability to tell oneself that what one is doing is necessary, professional, ordered, and someone else's moral responsibility. Understanding this, understanding the process, the design, the deliberate choices made at every level, is the only way to honor the obligation that the existence of Auschwitz imposes on everyone who learns of it. Not to forget. Not to allow abstraction to replace understanding, not to permit the bureaucratic language of perpetrators to obscure the human reality of victims, and to recognize in the structures and institutions of our own time the warning signs that those who built Auschwitz's design had been showing for a decade before the first prisoner arrived. The story of Auschwitz does not end with liberation, does not end with the trials, and does not end with the visits of 2 million people a year to the ruins of the crematoria. It continues in the testimony of survivors who are fewer with every passing year. It continues in the work of historians who examine the documents left by perpetrators and the accounts left by victims. It continues in the legal frameworks, the Genocide Convention, the Rome Statute, the Responsibility to Protect, that were built in partial and imperfect response to the Holocaust's lessons, and it continues in the memory of the 1.1 to 1.5 million people who entered Auschwitz and did not leave. People whose names were not always recorded, whose deaths were not always documented, but whose lives were real, whose families were real, whose worlds were destroyed, and who deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as the human beings they were, killed by a system that was designed, from its gate to its crematoria, from its numbered hooks to its fake showerheads, to deny that humanity. Auschwitz was designed, it was built, it was operated by people who made choices, and it was stopped. Not soon enough, not before more than 1 million people were killed, but stopped nonetheless. The permanence of the ruins, the survival of the documents, the testimony of the survivors, and the ongoing work of memory and scholarship are the answers that history has provided to the attempt to build a machine that would erase human beings without a trace. The machine failed at its own concealment, and in its failure it left behind the most complete and damning evidence of itself that any institution of mass murder has ever produced. Well, that is the full, terrible story of the evil design of Auschwitz and how it was built for extermination. If you found this video informative and important, please make sure to check out our video on what happened to the Nazi leaders who oversaw the Holocaust. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.